Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 125th episode of the Writ Podcast. Last week, the Ontario PCs managed to win two provincial by-elections. They had held both seats before, but one of them was being targeted by the Ontario Liberals. But nevertheless, the six-year-old Doug Ford government was able to increase its share of victory, its margin of victory in that riding. So what's the state of Ontario politics right now? And is Doug Ford cruising to another re-election, even if it's 2 years away? Joining me to break it all down is Sabrina Nanji, author of the Queen's Park Observer newsletter, and John Michael McGrath, writer and co-host of the On Poly podcast for TVO.org. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
I want to start with those by-elections. Now, we've all had a little bit of time to kind of sit back and digest the results. A lot of focus was on Milton. This is a riding in the GTA where there was talk that Bonnie Crombie might have even run there to try to get a seat because she doesn't have one. John Michael, why didn't Bonnie Crombie run in Milton?
Well, I think she was getting advice that whatever polls they had suggesting that they could make it a tight race, that there was some obvious risks for a brand new leader running for a seat where, yes, it's the Western GTA, but it's not exactly her base of support, her home turf, so to speak. And so there was a real risk of her running and losing. And based on the results that we in fact got in Milton, those warnings were probably prescient. And I think there are some people maybe patting themselves on the back around Bonnie Crombie's team for dodging that bullet right now.
That's happy to have avoided a loss. Congratulations. Yeah. Sabrina, going into the by-elections, we did see a couple polls that had, a tie in Milton. There was Z Hamid, who was running for the PCs, a known candidate, had some background with the Liberals. But when we got to election day, what were the expectations that the Tories had, the Liberals had going into those by-elections? Were the results a surprise in any way?
That's a great question because I think leading up to by-election day, you're right. The polls were suggesting that the Liberals and the Conservatives were neck and neck, and that's what the public polls were showing. And I'm from my sources, I'm also hearing that's what the internal polls were showing too for both sides. I know conservative insiders that I was talking to before the vote were saying they think it's too close to call, and I think you could really see just how maybe worried the Ford government was. They really wanted to keep this seat. I mean, Milton has gone back and forth, right? With the Liberals. And so I think that they were very worried. They were worried about the possibility of Bonnie Crombie. And we saw them, going full tilt in the riding. They had cabinet ministers door knocking, the premier himself, a ton of staffers, even on social media, if you're looking at the photos of the ministers going to door knock for Z or the Liberal MPPs, the handful of MPPs they do have going to door knock for their candidate, Galen Nadeau-Harris. I mean, there's just a couple of staffers where you see the PCs. I think they really went, whole hog on this. And so I do think even the Liberals too, this sort of felt like it was almost theirs to lose. If Bonnie Crombie had pulled this off, she could have had a lot of credit. She could have flexed her electoral prowess. I think the Conservatives would have been a lot more worried because Milton is a key riding. It's in the 905 that can make or break you. Bonnie Crombie's a former Mississauga mayor. She is popular in that area. And while she needs to, introduce herself and gain support outside of the province, I do think that maybe the PCs going so hard and being worried about the Liberals probably contributed to them increasing their vote share, right? It was a lot farther away. I think 9 points. I have to just double check because I don't have the numbers in front of me. 9 points apart this time, and it was just 4 points in 2022. So yeah, I think they managed to pull it off. It's not really feasible for them to be doing those kinds of efforts in a general election. They really did fight hard for the riding, and so I think they are definitely happy. The Liberals are licking their wounds a little bit.
Yeah, so it was, like you said, about an 9-point victory for the PCs there. The Liberals dropped a little bit. The PCs went up a few points. The NDP fell back. In the other by-election, Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, this was a very, very safe PC riding, and they won it with over 50% of the vote. The Liberals made an increase, but they were still way behind, about 35 points or so. I'd like to hear from both of you that looking at both of these by-elections, John Michael, you can go first. What's the takeaways from the results?
I think the most basic takeaway is that if you're an opposition party in Ontario right now, you can't assume that the Ford government is on the way to defeating itself in 2 years' time. They may still be defeated 2 years from now, but if you're the opposition, there's still clearly lots of work to do. That even that by-election in the Southwest that you mentioned, that I actually in some ways found that more interesting than the Milton result, because it's a riding where the Liberal Party has kind of been dead in the water for a decade now. And it's the kind of riding that they would dearly love to be competitive in again. And they're not there yet, as you say. They are still in a distant second, but they were in a distant third for most of the last several election cycles. So that is interesting to me. But yeah, overall, I guess I would say, if you're the Liberals, you can probably sort of write a story about how there's some encouraging signs from these by-elections, even if obviously they didn't win them. But they clearly have work to do. They can't rest on their laurels, and they need to figure out why the messaging that they brought forward didn't resonate in Milton. Because as much as I say I personally found the results in the Southwest more interesting, I mean, Milton really is that kind of riding that they have to be able to turn 2 years from now.
Yeah, if at the very minimum, if they're trying to get to official party status, so 12 seats, Milton might be one of those. And if they're trying to get up to 20, 25 official opposition in government, certainly Milton would be one of those. Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, probably not. But Sabrina, what were your big takeaways? If they start winning
in Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, so many other things have gone well for them in that scenario that we don't really need to discuss it.
Yeah, that's a sweep probably. Something has happened. Something very wrong has happened with the results. All right, Sabrina, what were your big takeaways from the by-elections?
Yeah, I'm with John Michael. Like, I definitely thought that maybe because the polls and everyone was saying it was neck and neck, that a lot of people are seeing this, and certainly the NDP's framing of it is that this was, Bonnie Crombie's chance to win, and she just can't do it. Like, she's not able to. She's not this great leader. But I do feel like there was a lot of hype around her, just like during the leadership race, right? Like, they were kind of talking a big game, like they're going to do it in one ballot, and that didn't quite happen. But to John Michael's point, I do think that that's it's still a good news story for the Liberals, right? Like, they don't have recognized party status. It's a by-election, low turnout. It wasn't going to change the government anyway. So there was a lot of factors at play here, but it's really a worse news story for the NDP because they're falling far back into third place. There's some theories floating around that they're eating into the NDP support, which is obviously going to help either move them into official opposition or maybe even government. Who knows? At least get recognized party status whenever the next election is. And so I just scheduled for 2026, and there's those rumors out there. I know Steve Fagan over at...
Oh, we'll get to it.
Yeah, okay, I thought so. Okay, but not to, go get ahead of ourselves. But yeah, I think that was probably my big takeaway. The Conservatives managed to hang on to it. They have been sitting pretty in the polls, but a lot could happen in 2 years. There's still this threat of an RCMP investigation hanging over their heads. And then meanwhile, I think this sort of sleeper story was that the New Blue Party came in ahead of the Greens. And I think even some of the polling had suggested the Greens were doing well, certainly better than they normally do in Lambton, Kent, Middlesex in particular. And so I kind of am just wondering maybe what happened there, because they had just come off this big historic by-election win just last fall in Kitchener Centre. And so I think that was also interesting that the New Blues, this Tory spinoff, sort of, pulled it off, at least maybe better than folks had expected. Kind of a weird offshoot story in the by-elections.
You mentioned, the PCs holding in the polls. They've been in power now for 6 years. It's the second half now of their second mandate. They're moving into that. You look at some other governments that were elected that long ago. François Legault, elected the same year in 2018. He's way back in the polls. You can look at some other examples where, things aren't going as well, but Doug Ford seems to be doing just fine. Party is usually still polling somewhere around the 40%. His approval ratings aren't terrific, but, we're seeing the results in the by-elections. The vote is still coming out. Sabrina, 6 years in, why are the PCs able to hold their own in a by-election and in the polls?
Yeah, I think John Michael kind of touched on some of that already. I mean, it's not so much how great Ford is doing, but also, how difficult it's been for the opposition parties to get their message out. I mean, the Liberals are still going through some growing pains with a new leader. I think Marit Stiles has maybe, relatively speaking, if we're comparing to Bonnie Crombie, especially had a bit more trouble, maybe, getting more headlines, grabbing headlines, and that sort of thing. But I do think if you're watching her in question period, I'm not sure how much of the electorate is actually doing that, like us, almost every day. But she does a good job of holding Ford to account. But again, it's still hard for them to get their message out there. Meanwhile, you'd think it should be easy, right? Because the Ford government has had this year of policy backtracks and snafus. But at the end of the day, I do think it's a lot of steady as she goes. I think the federal government is also a factor in this. We talk a lot about how Ontario tends to elect opposites at Queen's Park and on the Hill. And so I know, Eric, you've also mused about whether Trudeau was a drag on Bonnie Crombie. It turns out, she's slightly less popular than him in Ontario right now. But I do think that the public has been very forgiving, and the Ford government has made a lot of ambitious promises on housing, highways, things that really matter to certainly their base and a lot of the key ridings like the key regions like in the 905. I think where it gets tricky is if in 2 years from now, there's not as much housing as they said. There's really no progress on the highways. I think that's really where the opposition could probably come out and say, look, Doug Ford promised this, this, this. We're standing here in an empty lot. He couldn't do it. So I think for now they're sitting pretty, but a lot could change in 2 years.
John Michael, what do you think? Sometimes you say Teflon Doug Ford because everything seems to just slide off of him. We even saw an ad he put out recently. In it, he says, when we've made mistakes, we correct ourselves. It does seem like that is almost part of the brand, that when they make a misstep, they'll reverse themselves, and people seem to be, as Sabrina said, very forgiving about it.
Right, and I think you can't underestimate the effectiveness of owning up to mistakes. And it's a weird one because I think in professional politics, there's this idea that never concede anything. Now, admittedly, Doug Ford tends to drag out the eventual reversals, the eventual apologies, right? On the Greenbelt, it took like a year for the government to reverse its stance, despite some really toxic unpopularity for his proposals. But he did, in fact, reverse it and fessed up to it and said we're going to do something different, and it keeps working for him. I suppose it could stop working for him at some point, and then he will be in trouble. But I do think that the other issue here is that voters aren't going to vote for nothing, and the opposition. Sabrina mentioned that they've struggled to get their messages out. I would say also in the case of Bonnie Crombie, there are still relatively few people who are paying attention to what happens in the opposition benches at Queen's Park at all. And they don't necessarily have a clear idea of, unless you are in specifically the Toronto media market, you probably don't know who Bonnie Crombie is very well at all. And the good thing about having another 2 years, at least under current law, is that she can, for example, spend this summer doing the beer and barbecue circuits and getting her name and her face out there, and. We are, I would argue, I think we're seeing a bit of a mean reversion in Ontario politics, right? The 2018 and 2022 elections really saw the NDP do much better than their historic norms. They have now been the second party in the legislature for 2 elections in a row. But if you look at the current polling, they do seem to be sliding back into that third place position that they have really occupied since the Ray government. And if you're the Liberals, of course, that's very good news. It really does put you in a position to be the next official opposition. But there's that increment between, let's say getting the 30 to 33, 34% that just keeps you in the opposition benches, and depending on how the votes shake out, 35, 36, get up to 37%, and suddenly forming government becomes much more plausible.
2 years, we've mentioned that. It's been 6 years since Doug Ford and the PCs were first elected. John Michael, what is left for the government to do in the back half of the mandate?
Well, I mean, I think they are going to spend the next 2 years on the housing file, for example, being dogged by critics that say they aren't doing enough. The most recent piece of legislation brought forward by the housing minister has been, well, I have been one of those critics panning it, but lots of other critics have said it's just kind of maybe not a nothing burger exactly, but weaker than what the situation demands, and I think that's going to continue to be a problem for them, because I think they've really put themselves in a dynamic where they don't want to further anger the municipalities of Ontario if they don't have to, and they don't know really how much room for action they have to pursue more aggressive policies. In terms of some of the other big things, some of the other big priorities, they just today announced that they've issued contracts to start building the Bradford bypass, one of the major highway projects that this government has been backing. So I think we're going to hear a lot about those kinds of things in the next 2 years. The highways they want to build, the Ontario line that's going to make Toronto traffic even more of a disaster than it already was, but it's a good news story for the government. Things like that. I suspect that the next 2 years are going to be just a lot of, if not literally ribbon cutting announcements, then ribbon cutting adjacent, if I could put it that way.
Sabrina, is there anything else that you're expecting to see over the next 2 years?
I think John Michael has everything. I think that's, as we get closer to the campaign, we're definitely going to hear more about like highways. I don't think that Ford would want to go to the polls before there's like significant moves on those highways. They're like a cornerstone of his reelection campaign and his legacy projects. So yeah, I think Ontario Place, another, legacy project for Doug Ford, also a big political hot potato. But yeah, I think that's what we're going to hear a lot about. I think we're also going to hear a lot more about how Bonnie Crombie is the queen of the carbon tax and Justin Trudeau's best friend. They're spending millions to do that. And I feel like that's why it sort of already feels like we're in campaign mode. It kind of always feels like that a little bit with the Ford government in particular. But yeah, no, I think it's going to be all about building, housing. We're doing this. We're getting it done, as they like to say.
I've seen a couple of these
one more
ads,
thing, if I could.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think one of the stories that I expect us to see, at the risk of too much prediction, I suspect that the provincial budget will be balanced by the spring of 2026, and they are going to, Finance Minister Peter Bethlen-Falvey and the Premier will make a big noise about how, when we took power in 2018, they will say the province was bankrupt and the books were a mess, and now here we are, 8 years later, and the books are balanced again, and the province is growing, and they will be able to legitimately claim things like there's been a huge surge in manufacturing employment, and the economic growth is happening in parts of the province that, frankly, we didn't see as much of during certainly the last, let's say, 5 years of the Liberal tenure at Queen's Park. So there will be stuff on the economic and fiscal side that they will be able to say. Some of it will be exaggeration, as it always is in politics, but there will also be like serious things that they will be able to say totally factually.
It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that PCs have a lot of money, a lot like the federal Conservatives. We've seen that they have the money to spend on advertising. We've seen a couple ads about Bonnie Crombie. I've seen one with the kind of the construction worker flipping through his phone, stuff about Bonnie Crombie, and then a woman sitting at a kitchen table, I guess, also looking at stuff. So clearly they're going after Bonnie Crombie. There's no ads about, Marit Stiles and the NDP as far as I can see. So Sabrina, how well equipped are the Liberals right now to deal with this? Is the party in a better state 6 months after Bonnie Crombie came in than it was before?
Well, certainly they'll like to tell you that. I think, one thing that Bonnie Crombie, people liked about Bonnie Crombie was that she's got these like fundraising skills, and she did, raise $1 million by the end of the year last year. But obviously, when you're in opposition, I mean, for all the opposition parties, it sort of pales in comparison to how the Conservatives and the ruling party is fundraising. But I will say the PCs, even though they tend to blow their rivals out of the water when it comes to fundraising, they kind of had less of a stellar year this year so far, because they got rid of the Premier's Leaders Dinner. That's like the big fundraiser. There was like 4,000 people there the last time around. They raised like $6 million, or it was crazy. And I think they decided not to do it this year because of some of the controversy around the Greenbelt, insider access and all that stuff. But they've obviously been able to make it rain to take out these ads against Bonnie Crombie. And the first rule of politics is you've got to define yourself before your opponents do, and they are like right out of the gate doing this. And I think Bonnie Crombie is still, experiencing some growing pains. It's still a slow ramp up. She's still, settling into her groove, but she doesn't have a seat in the legislature, and so she can spend this time, going out there, going to barbecues, kissing babies, spaghetti dinners beyond the 905 and the GTA, like up in the north, the Southwest, where the Liberals really need to pick up in order to be competitive in 2026. So still a long ways to go. I don't think I would count Marit Stiles and the NDP out. They're also, posting fundraising numbers that they've never posted in the past. I think it's like almost $5 million they've said that Marit's raised since taking the leadership last year in February. And I think, this is just, obviously you need money to run a campaign, take out ads, buy pizza for your canvassers, get a tour bus, that sort of thing. And so I think it's shaping up to be a really competitive race right now. But yeah, for Bonnie Crombie in particular, she's kind of got to get a move on, I think, especially after what happened in Milton. Hindsight is 2020, but a lot of folks are saying we got to work on our ground game. We got to work on our fundraising and, really get the leader out there. She needs to be at Queen's Park more. The media, she tends to be a bit of a media darling. We do cover her whenever she's got something to say, but I think we're going to start to see a little bit more of that as she settles into the role.
John Michael, how would you rate her first 6 months or so?
I mean, it's been. I was going to use a cliche, but I won't say it's been the best of times. It's been the worst of times. But I do think the party definitely has better vibes, is the only thing I can think of, than it's had since the 2022 election, right? I mean, that was in some ways a worse defeat than 2018, I think, for the party, right? 2018 you could write off as Kathleen Wynne was so unpopular, and we just have to turn it around. And then to be returned after the 2022 election with the same sort of dismal performance in terms of the seat count was really, really shocking. And so I think so far, at least within the Liberal Party, there's been I think there's been more of a feeling that they've got a more plausible chance at success now. Bonnie Crombie, whatever her faults as a campaigner, is probably doing a better job than Stephen Del Duca was around this time. It would be difficult to compare those exactly because, of course, Stephen Del Duca won the leadership right before the COVID lockdown started. And so I think Crombie is doing well in a lot of the ways of just, re-energizing the party and making them feel like they've got a real shot at it. But it isn't materializing, obviously, in the results they want in a place like Milton. The question, I think, is, we will see, Milton probably won't be the last vacancy to hit the legislature. There are always rumors swirling about which MPP might be the next one to announce their retirement, that they want to go spend more time with their family.
Or with Pierre Poilievre.
Well, indeed, right. And so we will see whether they're able to make a better shot at the next by-election. Although, I mean, just because we've mentioned the calendar a few times already, I guess in about another year's time, we hit the threshold where after, I guess, June of 25, any vacancies that happen in the legislature don't need a by-election to be filled. So we're basically looking at the next 13 months or so.
We've mentioned them a bit throughout, so there might not be much else to say. But the New Democrats, official opposition, third in most polls, lost that Kitchener Centre by-election to the Greens a little while ago. So a little bit of a good news story for the Greens. Did not have good results in either of the two by-elections. Not that they were really in contention, but nevertheless, their vote was down quite a bit. Sabrina, challenges for the NDP right now?
Yeah, I think Bonnie Crombie is not only a factor for Doug Ford, but also Marit Stiles and the NDP. I mean, that's why we sort of saw the statements from the New Democrats after the by-election results was, well, Bonnie Crombie couldn't pull it off, and she's not all that's hyped up about her. And so I think that's also going to be an issue for them too. They obviously we talk about vote splitting a lot, right? Like in Canada, and so I think that battle, especially in the 905 and especially in Toronto and Toronto proper, like that's going to be a big issue. But I do think that, as we've said, the opposition is having a really hard time getting their message out. The Ford government also has this whopping majority, so they only have so many levers that they can pull, even in the House. And meanwhile, this week we're seeing a lot of them take a stand on the CAFIA, which is, I understand it's important, but I mean, we've been talking about it quite a bit, and we've seen it not only blow up the Ford, Ford's caucus, but also Marit Stiles and the NDP's caucus. And they're talking a lot about the CAFIA when I think, a lot of folks in Ontario want to be talking more about, healthcare and education and issues more closer to home. So I think, for the NDP, they probably need to and they are saying that, internally, that they don't want to be distracting from things. And so I think, for the opposition, they really, all parties really need to focus and get in on it, because it is kind of easy. There's no shortage of scandals and controversy with this Ford government. So it should be kind of easy for them, but it's not. And so I think that's really going to be a challenge in particular for the NDP too, because now they've got to not only, position themselves as government in waiting and the best alternative to Doug Ford when, the by-elections show that voters might see the Liberals as that party, but they've also got to hold Doug Ford to account at the same time. So a big challenge for them.
John Michael, you mentioned that the NDP kind of going back to a more traditional place that they've been, under Howard Hampton and then for the first couple of elections with Andrea Horwath. Does the NDP still think of themselves as a party, the alternative government, or are they going back to that old place that they were for the previous couple of decades?
I think if they are returning to the historic third-party role, it's unwilling, and it's not what they're aiming for right now. Marit Stiles still, is, I think, from the side of the party that is still very much aiming to build a party that can form government. But people have all sorts of plans, and then events happen. And I think, my sort of median case scenario for the next election right now, looking at the polls, I would say, I mentioned Southwestern Ontario. I think that's an area where the NDP could probably hold on to some seats and deny the Liberals some wins that the Liberals would very much like. They have been shut out of that part of the province for so long, and people who are, people who backed Bonnie Crombie for the leadership are people like, Dwight Duncan, a son of Southwestern Ontario, and I know it pains him that the party has been shut out from sort of the Windsor area for so long. And so the NDP, I think, we've mentioned vote splitting. I think one of the other things you will see is there are parts of the province, and the north would be another case of this, where for voters in those regions, the Liberals are just not a realistic contender for power, and so those are areas where you will see it will just boil down to Tory NDP fights. But the path to a majority in the legislature doesn't really go through those parts of the province, right? It's like Ottawa and the GTA, maybe a handful of other big cities where the decision will be made.
Will the decision be made in June 2026? Does anybody want to take that on?
I'm dying to speculate on this. Like, I have to say, like, and it is just that, I guess, speculation. Like, I read, I think I saw Steve Paikin was the first one to write about it.
I believe my colleague was on that. Yes.
Yeah. And, I'll admit, like, I read it and I was like, ah, come on. Like, I kind of was like, no, it's not going to happen. And then, like, I started hearing other little things. Someone had put a bug in my ear that essentially Elections Ontario had advised the government that if they wanted to match the new federal boundaries, which Ontario tends to do, and which I think it seems like they will go that way, Elections Ontario, in order for them to make it work logistically by 2026, they asked the government, if you could please table the legislation by the end of this current session. There's only like 5 sitting weeks left. And every time I ask the Attorney General's office, it's like radio silence. So anyways, that whole thing was just a hint to me that if they were potentially going to go early with the new boundaries, that legislation would need to be on the table, and it's not there yet. So that's just like another hint, and that's making me go, I might just be like pulling at threads here, because I'm very interested in where this goes. But like I said, I think that the government's going to want some more progress on some of their key projects here, liberalizing booze sales, having shovels in the ground for the highways, getting closer to balancing the books, all that stuff. I think, making some actual progress on housing rather than just policy backtracks. I think they're going to want to have those things in the bag before they go. And so at this point, I don't know if it's so much, well, what's happening federally might impact what happens provincially, and we want to go now. We're riding high on 2 back-to-back by-election wins. I don't know if it's so much that as they really need to be able to like show something to the public the next time, whenever that happens, the next time around.
We have scheduled dates, but it's
mentioning beer.
Yeah, but I mean, we have scheduled dates, but it's always very appealing for majority government leading the polls to not risk waiting. And then there's the option going next spring while Justin Trudeau is still prime minister versus the spring after that when Pierre Poilievre is the prime minister. And maybe Ontarians are still happy with Pierre Poilievre and the brand is good. Maybe it's not. I don't know. Does it just make sense to us, but no one's thinking about it in the Premier's office, John Michael?
I will confess that I haven't actually asked anybody in the Premier's office about this one, but let me, I guess, make the case that, if they wait until 2026, it will be 8 years of power. It's reasonably common for governments to get their first re-election in Ontario politics. It's very hard to get a second. Very few premiers really get that third term. Dalton McGuinty did, notably, but Mike Harris and Ernie Eves did not. Bob Rae, obviously, very famously did not. David Peterson did not. So just the length of time that will have elapsed from 2018 on its own, will be going against the government by that point. We've mentioned, the changes in federal politics that could affect things. I think that, the opposition will likely, at least one of the opposition parties, will likely be in a stronger position 2 years from now. At a certain point, voters do start looking for other options. I don't know. I have not seen a ton of enthusiasm from the Premier when we've been speculating about this stuff before. I mean, people may not remember, but prior to the last election, there was also some speculation that Doug Ford might call the 2022 election earlier than the law required, and that came to nothing. This is never like. Politics is not always an area of purely rational calculation, and some of this stuff comes down to like the animosity that I think a lot of conservatives feel about. Doug Ford would inevitably be compared to Justin Trudeau, who did call an election earlier than it was needed, and I think Doug Ford doesn't want to be the subject of those comparisons. And sometimes that's enough to make the decision for people.
All right. Well, we'll see. We'll see. Maybe we'll get an early election and make me happy at least, because I like elections. All right. Well, thanks to both of you. Lots of going on in Ontario politics, so I appreciate you coming on to break it all down.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.